And on behalf of the three of us today, I would like to present to you the economic pressure across generations, the impact on HCC. Just as a general outline for today, I will be talking about the background and literature review, as well as the study purpose of our research. I will also talk about our model, the research method, and the measures, as well as the analytic plan. And to finish it off, I will be talking about the results, conclusions, and the future directions of our study. So to begin, what is cortisol? Cortisol is a stress hormone that is excreted from the body as a part of its fight or flight response. It also can be used as a biomarker for chronic stress. Typically, cortisol is measured through saliva, urine, and drawing blood. Hair cortisol is also a newer way of measuring chronic stress. It is more non-invasive compared to drawing blood. And it has also been found that males typically tend to have higher levels of hair cortisol as children and into adulthood. Some research has been done using hair cortisol before, in which excessive amounts of stress has led to higher concentrations of hair cortisol, or HCC. But in PTSD patients where they endure higher levels of stress, it tended to lower their HCC. Another type of stress that has been looked at is economic hardship compared to HCC. And this typically tended to have mixed results, in which some have found that there's no association between parental income and HCC, while some has found that a higher parental income actually increases HCC. This trend tends to continue into intergenerational research, where they look at more than one generation at a time. And so it has been found that the levels of HCC in preschoolers actually increase if parental education was lowered. On the other hand, higher levels of stress endured during pregnancy tended to lower the HCC levels in newborn babies. So what don't we know? Previous studies have looked at HCC across generations through a cross-sectional design. In our research, we used a longitudinal research design. So we looked at data at multiple points in time rather than just all at one time. Other studies also looked at stress just in general. We wanted to look at chronic stress in particular. So in our present study, we wanted to understand the correlation between economic pressure and HCC across multiple generations. Previous research has looked at intergenerational studies, parental education, and income, but we wanted to add to the literature by determining the correlation between economic pressure felt by our first generation, when our second generation were children, and the HCC levels when our second generation was in adulthood. So from this information, we wanted to understand HCC as a biomarker of chronic stress. So just for our model, the first measure we took was economic pressure of G1, so our first generation. And we looked at this when our second generation, G2, was around the age of 15. And then at time 2, we also looked at the economic pressure of G2 as well as HCC of G2 when they were 41 years old. We also looked at gender of G2 as a potential variable. So we obtained all of our data from 2 samples. The first sample was the Iowa Youth and Families Project. This began in 1989, and it consisted of a 7th grade child around the age of 13 with 2 biological parents and a sibling within 4 years above or below them. This sample consisted of 451 families. Our second sample was the Iowa Single Parents Project, which began in 1991, which consisted of a 9th grade child around the age of 15 with a single mother and a sibling within 4 years above or below them as well. This sample consisted of 108 families. In 1994, these two samples merged to form the Family Transitions Project, which followed these children into adulthood. So this group of a total of 559 families is a predominantly white group, and they are mostly based in rural Iowa. The measures we took, the first one was economic pressure of G1. This was a self-reported financial pressure, and it was based on 3 scales. The first one was financial cutbacks. So maybe the family had to lessen their budget each month. The second one was can't make ends meet. So maybe they couldn't make a house payment. And the third one was unmet material needs. So they could have had an insufficient amount of food or clothes. The second measure we looked at was also the economic pressure. This was measured in the same way as G1. We also looked at the hair cortisol of G2. This was a biological hair sample that was provided to us. This sample was 3 centimeters of hair from a particular region of the head. This hair sample was then sent to a lab and assayed. This was done actually on campus in Bessie Hall by Dr. Bronikowski. And then gender of G2 was just self-reported. For our analytic procedure, we used SPSS. We also used Pearson correlations. In our two-tailed calculation, any p-value that was less than 0.05 was deemed significant, and anything that was above 0.05 was not significant. So from our table, you can see that the economic pressure felt by G1 strongly correlated to the hair cortisol felt by G2. We can also see that the gender of G2 strongly correlated to the hair cortisol of G2. So overall, G1 economic pressure related to HCC and G2 when they were adults. And consistent with previous research, our males tended to have higher levels of hair cortisol than our females. And although in our pilot sample of 47 people, this wasn't a correlation, in our full sample, the economic pressure felt by G1 when G2 was in childhood, it strongly related to the economic pressure felt by G2 when they were adults. And all of this highlights the detrimental effect of economic pressure felt at a young age, and it lends continuing support for hair cortisol as a biomarker of chronic stress. As far as future directions of this research, we want to expand our methods of our current pilot study into our full sample of G2 adults. We would also like to assess these relationships in samples of greater ethnic and racial diversity, since our sample was predominantly white. Lastly, we would also like to explore other early measures of stress and how they relate to both G1 and G2 HCC over time. Such examples of these early measures could be marital conflict or harsh parenting. I would like to give a special thanks to Dr. Nepple and Olivia Diggs for all of your help on this project, as well as the Iowa State Honors Program for bringing us together. Thank you for listening.
All right, as we switch to the next presenter, are there any questions for Megan?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So the H1 and G1, so when the G1 reported that they have financial hardship, like was there any measure that G2 was asked about how they feel, like whether they perceive that their parents are having some financial issues?
As far as I know, I think there were questions like that, but they didn't necessarily pertain to what we were looking at in this study. So we didn't include them in this research.
All right, thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How did you become interested in this topic? Like the HCC seems really niche. I'm curious how you kind of got to that.
Okay, so I'm a biology major, and so all of those kind of things really interest me. And I got brought to Dr. Nepple in other research that they're doing. So this just really correlated and was a big bonus for me.
Cool. It was one niche in our study that she could really hone in on to give in her biological interest.
Yeah, that's really neat.
Yep. Are there any other
Any other questions? No?
All right.
Okay, so the other Megan.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Megan Custis. I'm a junior studying public relations and technical communications. And the topic I'll be discussing today is disparities in basic housing needs as a predictor of psychological well-being among community dwelling older adults. Now I know that rolls right off the tongue. We'll go through all those little aspects today. And I'm so glad you are all here, whether the few of us in person or those online. Now, older adults are individuals aged 65 or over, and they make up 16.5% of our population. It's projected by 2060 that they'll make up nearly a quarter of our population at 23%. Safe and adequate housing are basic human needs, and ensuring older adults have what they need to age is an important policy issue. The research objective of our study was to uncover what disparities are present between minority and white older adults' housing conditions and what consequent effects that has on psychological well-being. Now, the good news here in all this complex topic is that this is a topic that can or will affect all of us. You may have experienced the things I'll discuss today with a parent or a grandparent, or you can definitely expect to in the future. So before we begin, I want you to take just a second and picture an older adult that you know in your mind. Picture maybe where they live, how they feel about their living situation, and let them be your example as we continue today throughout this presentation. Now, many factors connect health and housing, and this diagram is by no means exhaustive, but it offers us a helpful place to start. Older adults spend more time at home, and because they're spending more time at home modifications can be a crucial aspect of their well-being. Now, this can include the grab bar by a toilet so your older adult can get up independently. It could include a seat in a shower or tub so your older adult doesn't come fatigued while they're bathing. The physical neighborhood of a house can also greatly affect how an older adult feels in their living situation. And we'll look at a factor today called community cohesion. This is the level essentially to which how safe you feel in your neighborhood, how comfortable you are there, etc. And older adults also experience what's called place attachment. And this is how sentimental you become over your home environment. And again, that might be something that you can sympathize with. The older adult you thought of could have lived in their same home for 40 years or 50 years or 60 years or more than that. They could have raised children there or grandchildren there, and that home becomes very special to them. So they may prefer to age there rather than relocating and going through those emotions in late life. Now, before we began our study, we needed to know what was already known and proven about housing and aging. So first, because of that place attachment and many other unique factors, we know that aging in place is the main desire of older adults. This is why our study looks specifically at community dwelling older adults. Now, community dwelling, that means an older adult is living in a neighborhood, usually in a standalone home, rather than a nursing home or an assisted care facility. We also know that home modifications can keep older adults in their homes longer, and that homes with modifications report less depressive symptoms than those without them. Since we're looking at minorities versus white housing, it's important to contextualize our findings by saying that we know minorities face greater adverse experiences in their lifetimes compared to their white counterparts. This could include increased poverty, decreased opportunities for employment, discrimination, prejudice, etc. Specifically within the housing domain, minorities have faced a history of redlining, which could have affected their lifetime access to housing. Minorities are also significantly more likely to live in an older home that needs serious modifications, though that home is significantly less likely to receive those needed modifications. Now, after analyzing all of these factors, we were able to funnel down a little bit further and analyze what specific gaps in the literature could our study uniquely fill? There is an abundance of literature on housing quality and psychological well-being, but our study wanted to analyze specifically that effect within older adults and further what racial differences were present within that. We also noticed that minorities have been proven in the literature to face greater adverse experiences. So our study wanted to look specifically at what experiences within housing affected minority psychological well-being, possibly more than white counterparts. And lastly, previous research has proven that unmet basic needs are a predictor of mortality, but our study wanted to focus on specifically housing quality independent of other unmet basic needs, such as economic or food security. Now, take a deep breath, that was a lot of information. You have some context on what issues this project analyzed, health, housing, aging. But before we continue, I want you to really take a minute to imagine what the implications of this could realistically be. So I want you to imagine living in living situation number 1 here. How would it feel to live here? Where your window is boarded up, your floor may be in disrepair, your kitchen is not usable. What does your older adult look like when they're in living situation number 1? Compare that then to situation number 2, where your house is clean and tidy, you're likely safe there and comfortable there. What does your older adult look like here? I can tell you that when I think of my older adult, I think of my great-grandma Joy, and I picture her in living situation number 1 here, and I see that look she's giving me, and it is not one of pleasure. It is not a look that I want to see. Research has proven that your housing quality affects your housing satisfaction and your psychological well-being. And when you look at these images, that definitely makes sense, right? But it's important then that we add in this contextual layer that minorities may have faced experiences throughout their lifetime that affected their access to housing, which is compounding in their late life. Now, upon the literature review and the gaps we identified, I was able to come to 3 hypotheses that guided this study. First, I hypothesized that housing quality and conditions are likely to be associated with mental health outcomes because of what we know about older adults spending more time in the home and being more vulnerable to their home environment. Second, based on their cumulative disadvantage, history of redlining, and likelihood to live in older dwellings, I hypothesized that minority older adults are likely to experience disparities in their housing and neighborhood conditions. And then assuming that number 2 is met and using those same 3 conditions, I hypothesized that the effect of housing and neighborhood on psychological well-being would be higher among minority older adults compared to their white counterparts. To conduct our study, then, we used data from the National Health and Aging Trends Study. This is called the NHATS. It's a nationally representative survey of Medicare beneficiaries aged 65 and over. We used data from the first wave, which was conducted in 2011 by in-person interviews. Our final analytic sample contained 6,424 community dwelling older adults and included non-Hispanic Blacks, Hispanics, and non-Hispanic whites. Respondents who lived in a nursing home or an assisted care facility were not included in this study because our study focused on community dwelling older adults. Now, our study used 3 measures to analyze psychological well-being and 4 measures to analyze the home and neighborhood condition. For psychological well-being, the interviewer started with what's called the Patient Health Questionnaire. And this indicated for the sample person how often in the last month did they experience various symptoms indicative of depressed mood and anxiety. Our third factor then for psychological well-being was worry about falls. Now, falls can be debilitating to an older adult. They can cause them to lose independence, and they can just make them feel unsafe in their home. So the interviewer asked, in the last month, how often did you worry about falling down? Followed by, in the last month, how often did this worry limit your activities? Now, when the interviewer was analyzing the home, they had a checklist, and they were looking for things that would have been problematic. So in the inside of the home, this would have included things like peeling paint, problems with kitchen appliances, evidence of pests, etc. On the outside of the home, those problems could have included boarded up windows, missing siding, graffiti on neighborhood buildings, so on and so forth. For home modifications, the interviewer went into the bathroom and they were looking for 3 specific modifications. These were a raised toilet or a raised toilet seat, grab bars in the shower or tub area, and a seat in the shower or tub. Now, these were selected because of their relevance to fall avoidance and because they're commonly recommended by medical professionals. Lastly, then the interviewer had the sample person self-report their level of community cohesion, and this was how well they knew their neighbors, how much they trusted their neighbors, and overall how safe they felt in their neighborhood environment. To reach results, we ran several analyses to test those 3 hypotheses we came to. So first, to compare white and minority housing conditions, we ran a descriptive analysis to compare the means of each variable across the different ethnicity groups. Then to compare mental health outcomes, we needed to learn more about associations, so we ran regression models. And lastly, to analyze which group experienced greater mental health outcomes, we ran moderated analysis on top of those regression models to test for interactions. Now presented here are the results for both the inside and the outside of the home. The inside is on the left and the outside is on the right. In accordance with hypothesis 2, we did find a disparity in both of these areas. Now you can see that Blacks and Hispanics report higher levels on both of these. And higher levels mean that the interviewer did find things that are problematic. So they did see boarded up windows, or they did see flooring in disrepair, so on and so forth. It's notable that in the outside of the home, whites were the lowest. They reported an average of 1.14, and Blacks scored over double that at 2.44. Now for home modifications, these numbers represent the average number of modifications, and we did not see a large disparity here, but there's a slight difference between the various groups. And this can be explained because these modifications can be commonly not only provided or recommended by medical professionals, but possibly provided on Medicare. Looking then at community cohesion, this was interesting. We actually found that Blacks and Hispanics reported higher levels of community cohesion compared to their white counterparts. And as we discussed, this is a positive, desirable trait in your community. So when we compound all these findings together and look at psychological well-being, on the y-axis here, that's the compounded score of psychological well-being using those 3 factors. And the x-axis is the housing quality. So in accordance with hypothesis 3, the impact of housing quality was more detrimental on minority older adult psychological well-being compared to their white counterparts. So you can see whites are represented by the blue line, and they experience the highest psychological well-being regardless of housing quality. Hispanics follow then at the orange line, and Blacks are represented by the gray line. You can see too that when Hispanics and Blacks housing conditions change, they experience a more drastic drop in psychological well-being than white counterparts when they have the same housing conditions. Now there are a few factors that can help us explain these findings further. We'll look again at household disorder, the inside of the home. We found that household disorder was negatively associated with psychological well-being, positively associated with depressive symptoms, and positively associated with worry about falls. Now, in accordance with hypothesis 2, we found that minority older adults had worse inside the home conditions. So it makes sense that their psychological well-being was lower when you compound all these well-being factors together. Looking then at community cohesion a little bit closer, we found that this was positively associated with psychological well-being, negatively associated with depressive symptoms, and not correlated to worry about falls. And this suggests that community cohesion may be able to combat depressive symptoms among older adults. This study bolsters our knowledge on housing and environmental conditions, which are critical assets in late life. It's important we know these disparities so we can begin addressing them and ensuring older adults have what they need in late life. Older adults are great assets to our communities. They may prefer to age in place because they love their community and they value being active in it. Knowing these disparities can help us be cognizant of their needs and help meet them. A way to do that then is by providing those home modifications, and policy is starting to address this. The Department of Housing and Urban Development recently launched what's called the Older Adults Home Modification Program. And this allows nonprofit organizations, state and local government entities, and public housing authorities to access funding that can be used to revitalize or repair low-income elderly homeowners' homes. Programs like this show the possible promise of giving more attention to these topics through research. So it's important to note that this study was not without its limitations. First, we used cross-sectional data, meaning the interviewer went to the home once, and then they did not go back to check anything again. We did not consider rural versus urban communities, and this could have affected our results for community cohesion. As we know, those two types of communities can be vastly different. Lastly, these results can't be generalizable for all minority groups. We did not consider mixed races or Asians because unfortunately, their sample size was not large enough in the NHATS data pool. Now, there are also many areas that this research can be expanded upon. For example, we didn't consider housing cost burden, meaning spending over 30% of your income on housing costs. And this could greatly affect psychological well-being among older adults as well. Because our findings for community cohesion were notable, it would be interesting to explore these more, whether that's considering that rural versus urban difference or finding what factors our community resources could have played a role in that. Now, at the beginning of this presentation, I asked you to think of an older adult in your mind and imagine them in these two living situations. I hope throughout this presentation you gain an understanding of why this topic is important or gain some kind of inspiration to help your older adult or the older adults in your community. I owe an enormous thank you to my supervisor, Jill, for all the work she also helped me with on this project. She not only encouraged me to conduct this research in the first place, but truly walked alongside of me every step of the way. So I'm just so grateful to be working under her and learning so much every step of the way. I'm happy to talk further about my research as well, and I can be reached at mrcustis@iastate.edu. Thank you so much for your attention today. I appreciate it.
Very good. Any questions for Megan? I have a couple.
Okay.
I found the picture, the images. I'm a picture person, so seeing those images of the various home environments was really powerful, actually. So you know, obviously you chose to look at psychological impacts and looking at the differences between those two home environments. I'm thinking about other possible consequences or outcomes that there could be in addition to psychological outcomes. Can you speculate it or tell me what you know about the literature about what else could be impacted beyond depression and well-being?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, one thing to assume is if your house looks like that, it's pretty likely that you're facing other issues, as you mentioned. So one thing to consider really could be that housing cost burden. It could be that there is just absolutely no money left to make those modifications, which means that other areas could be lacking, right? So do they have the food that they need? If their house is looking like that, are they mobile to be in their home, or should they maybe, be living somewhere else? We talked about aging in place. That's a great solution and preferred by many older adults, but it's not always feasible. And again, that income could be coming to play. They may not be able to afford to move somewhere else. So that's a great point, that if your housing situation looks like that, there are likely many other factors that compound there to kind of keep you trapped in a situation that looks similar to that.
Even thinking about the, in physical health ramifications. Social interaction, social isolation, the consequences they're many, unfortunately, right?
Yeah.
All right, good job. I'm going to ask you the same question you asked Megan Carty. How did you get involved in this research?
So over winter break, Jill encouraged me to conduct some original research since we had plenty of time on break. And I've gained an interest in housing through other internships I've worked. So I figured why not explore housing? And I'd also worked on a project related to aging in place. So kind of looking at those two factors together, seeing what effect that would have on psychological well-being. And then when we looked at the data, it became clear that looking at racial differences within that would not only be unique after we looked at the literature, but also interesting and just add another layer to this. So kind of all those things together led me to this study.
Excellent, great job, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, sir, you are up. And then when you're finished, you can shut it off, or if we don't know how to do that, we'll have Jamie do it. Okay.
I think that was yours. So
Do you want to double check connection? I'm still on Zoom.
yeah, I just lost.
Yes.
I just clicked it once to make sure you didn't, but I just don't know why
You
it's
guys make
not.
sure that we're still on Zoom. so
Yeah.
that we're not seeing
Okay.
the audience box.
Okay.
All right, we're good.
It
Thank you.
scared me
I
a little
noticed that
bit.
as well, so. I'm glad you said something. Thanks.
Yeah, here.
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Sir Paul, and I am senior studying Child Family Services with a secondary major in international study. So for my research today, I'm going to present the association between economic pressure, GPA, mother support, and perceived educational attainment. And the co-authors for this research are Olivia Diggs, my graduate mentor, and Dr. Tricia Neville, my faculty mentor from the Department of Human Development and Studies. So in the following slides, I will talk about the study background, literature review, the purpose of our study and our proposed model, and research method, measures, analytic plans, and the result of our studies, and I'll briefly talk about the conclusion. So the dependent variable on our study is perceived higher education attainment. First, we are interested in looking at why college education is important. Studies show that individuals who have a bachelor's degree or higher education, they have a higher earning. Moreover, higher education is associated with health. So people who are highly educated, they reported that they have better health and lower mortality rates. Not only that, but also higher education is associated with higher level of well-being, for example, happiness and mental well-being. We understand that college education is important and the benefits of having a higher education. The first barrier for students attending college is economic pressure. Children's enrollment in college go down when parents can pay for college. So parents who have significant financial difficulties, they have less involvement. And research shows that children have more academic success when parents support them. So another barrier is GPA. Whether students go to college or not depend on their GPA, their preparation for college, and the support that they receive from their parents. Study shows that students' high school GPA can tell us their college freshman year GPA and their graduation status. A third barrier for students attending college is the support that they receive from their parents. A barrier is the support that they receive from their parent at home or while they're home. Research has shown that the positive parenting during adolescence has an influence on better educational attainment. Furthermore, there are some gaps in the literature. Previous study examined the association between parents' ability to pay for college and children's college attendance in a cross-sectional research design. Something that we are adding to the literature is using a longitudinal research design where we look at our data over time. Another study examined the connection between economics and aspirations for college education, but didn't assess when we explain that relationship. We examined GPA and mother support as a possible explanation. Our study specifically seek to understand the association between family economic pressure and perceived higher education in 493 youth. We add to the literature by examining students' GPA and maternal support as an explanation for why economic pressure may be related to post-secondary education plan. So this is our proposed model. So as I explained, the first relationship that we are interested in looking at is parents' economic pressure at time 1 and perceived education and attainment at time 3, and when the youth are 18. We are also interested in looking at this relationship. As you can see, we are interested in looking at this relationship over 3 time points, time 1, time 2, and time 3. In addition to the relationship between family economic pressure and at time 1 and the perceived educational attainment at time 3. We are also looking at GPA and mother support at time 2 when the youth are 16. And we are also looking at how both of these are related to economic pressure as well as perceived education. This is our research method, very similar to the previous presenter. So I would like to inform you a little bit about the sample. So for our sample, we use 2 family projects. Our youth and family projects, our FP and single parent projects, SPP. So our FP began in 1989, which has 451 2-parents family, and that was when the adolescents are 13. But in 1991, we had 108 single mothers, 1-parents family, and that was when the youth are 15 years old. However, in 1994, we merged 2 studies together to make a total of 559 participants, and we call that Family Transition Projects, FTP. So we have been following this cohort from age 30 into adulthood. And here are the measures. Time 1, when the kids are 15, parents report economic pressure, and they report it on 3 time scales. The first one is they can make ends meet, such as not having enough money or leftover money at the end of the month to afford their home, food, or clothing. And then the second one is material needs, for example, not having enough money for clothing that are necessary. And the third one is painful cutbacks, financial cutbacks, having to come back on saving. And at time 2, when the youth are 16, they report GPA and mother support. For mother support, we did an observation. On video recorded family discussion task. So what happened in this task was that the mother and teenagers, they sit down together and they answer questions and discuss about themselves. And it is video recorded, so we don't call what they say, but we call it their behavior back at the lab. And then positive reinforcement, encourage, independence, and warmth are 3 of many qualities that we looked at. Time 3, when adolescents are age 18, we look at perceived educational attainment, and they reported their perceived educational future education, and the higher is PhD. We analyze our data using SPSS, which is a statistical software. We ran a Pearson correlation between all the study variables as a statistical significant level. At a statistical level, value of P is less than 0.05. So if P value is greater than 0.05, the results were not significant. So results, to remind you that the first relationship that we were interested in looking at is the one between parents' economic pressure and perceived educational attainment. And we found that higher level of economic pressure associated with lower degree of perceived education. And we also found that high pressure is related to lower GPA, and higher GPA is related to higher support by the mother, and also higher GPA is related to higher perceived level of education, and also higher mother support is related to higher educational attainment. In conclusion, economic pressure was negatively related to perceived future education and GPA, but not related to mother support. A high GPA was related to high level of mother support. And then GPA and mother supports were related to higher perceived future education. So this result shows that maternal support, CY at the home, has an impact on the educational attainment the student think he or she will receive. And future directions, our next step is to test a causal model. A causal model is a more advanced statistical test to test how the variables are related to each other. So what we can conclude from the causal model is that, for example, time one, parents' economic pressure causes time two, students' GPA and or even mother support. And our study is a correlational research design, meaning we look at the two variables and assessing the relationship between them. So given these results, it would also be important for other researchers to look at, to assess the relationship across the sample of different ethnic groups and populations. Yeah, that's what I have, and I would like to acknowledge Dr. Neville and my graduate mentor Olivia, and then our McNabb program for helping me with this research and for supporting me throughout this research. And thank you.
Questions for Sir? I also have a question. Did you happen to follow the teenagers and to find what their actual educational attainment was and correlate that back to the support they were being given?
So the teenager that we're looking at?
Yeah, so you said that you were looking at what they were looking to attain in their education. Did you ever follow it and see what they actually obtained?
No, we didn't look at it, but they said like their perceived the higher education that they would perceive is PhD. So right now they are like, we look at when they're young, so right now they're pretty old. So some of them actually attain, the PhD degree or a bachelor degree.
Okay.
Yeah, so Olivia and I have actually talked about that. That'd be a really interesting fourth time point to add to the model. Would be, okay, so here's where they sit at age 18, how high they wanted to go. Now let's look at them at age 45 and see how high do they actually go, and then see if that all holds true throughout the model. So that's exactly what Olivia and I were talking about, thinking about as a next step. Yeah, very good.
So I didn't find, and so like in your findings, you didn't find any association between the economic hardship and mother support. Was it like a no relationship whatsoever, or it was a weak relationship to significant?
Yeah, it's like it's not related. So because economic pressure, we find that it's not affect like mother support.
But the mother support was highly associated with the GPA.
Yeah, so if students have a higher GPA, that means their mother is more likely to support them to go to college and to pursue the education.
Yeah. It's almost like you see that. I mean, it'd be interesting to see once you put it into the causal model, right? But I mean, is there those indirect pathways going from economic pressure to I forgot the other economic
Higher education.
Yeah, no, GPA, thank you. I'm losing my train of thought. If it goes from economic pressure to GPA to mother support to educational attainment, see if it really does follow that indirect pathway. But I suppose it's nice to see that economic pressure doesn't really influence how much support they're giving to their adolescent. Yeah, lost my train of thought.
Any more questions?
Do you want to share, Sir, how you got interested in this topic and where you plan to take this information from here?
I think two reasons I was interested in this research. First is I'm going to go into grad school in higher education and student affairs. So I really want to do research that related to, economic pressure and related back to like students from, underrepresented students and how that impact them. And and the second one is, as a first generation college student, someone coming from low income family background, I'm really interested in looking at how all of this impacts parents and, students' education and how, parents are doing. So, yeah.
All right, very good, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you want to or Jamie, do you want to shut the PowerPoint off and we'll leave the camera going and maybe we can just kind of have a discussion around the table if there's any other questions for the whole group?
I don't know if I can clearly I saw that
That's a good question.
for now, so I don't really know how to do it.
Okay, that sounds good. Sir, do you just want to have a seat over here in the corner, maybe? I just have a couple of questions since we have some time for all three of you. It's easier just to see you around the table than have you all stand up there. But I'm just interested in, as you guys put a lot of time into the research that you put together, and I'm wondering what the biggest challenge that you faced as you were putting your research together.
For me, I was like, I'm really terrified of public speaking and really bad at it. So I would say the bigger challenge would be like adding what to put in the PowerPoint and then what to say after that
Sure.
slide. So
Yeah.
that would be like one of the challenges.
Yeah, you've come a long way. You've done a lot of practice, and the practice shows. You've done a good job.
I would say I like public speaking. I was excited to be able to kind of do a small scale of it again. But for me, it was really difficult to scale down the information. I'm sure you two relate to this. Like, you know so much about your research, and it's really hard to deduce what someone who knows nothing about this might be able to understand or not understand. For example, my first draft I gave to my roommates. I said, before I get any further, someone has to listen to it, so it's you guys, whatever. And I hadn't even mentioned what an older adult was, at what age that really, began here. And they were like, you said so much stuff that we didn't even understand, but we didn't know exactly what age an older adult meant.
How is that defined?
Yeah, kind of deducing, okay, you really don't need to know every nitty gritty fact to understand this. That was a little bit difficult for me when planning all that.
Yeah.
I definitely think my hardest part was doing my literature review. So there's not a lot of information or research that has been done with hair cortisol before. And so that was really hard to narrow down to be like, okay, are there any correlations between any of these studies at all? So a lot of the points I had made on the PowerPoint were just a select, like maybe one or two research studies that had seen those correlations. So that was pretty difficult for me.
Which means that we're doing breakthrough research, right?
I guess so.
That's been done in the past.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of lit reviews, so I've gotten pretty good at reading through all the ones I don't want and all the ones that are important.
Good.
I also remember like it was very hard for me to find the article that related to my research. You know what I mean? It's like, some like put in some of the word in a different word. It was really hard.
Right. So a good learning experience.
It is, yeah.
Right. So did anything surprise you in terms of the results? Were you surprised by anything that was analyzed?
I was mostly surprised that males had higher levels of hair cortisol. In my head, I would imagine women are just more stressed all the time because there's a lot more going on. But it's just a consistent, males have higher levels. That was what was weird for me.
Right. And that, I don't know if you realize that, but in that sample of 47, there were only 6 males.
Yeah.
And so for it to have to drive that, be that driving force with only 6 males in the pool was interesting too.
Yeah.
Yeah, good point.
I think for us, the community cohesion results were really notable. That was the factor that we didn't pay a ton of attention to till the end. We thought it might be interesting to run a few tests on that. And it was really interesting that the reported conditions of the inside and the outside of the home was lower for minorities, but that didn't really seem to matter for community cohesion. And we don't know exactly why that is. So, but as I said in the presentation, that would be really interesting to study to see, is it just a relational thing? Were there community resources where those individuals lived? Did they live in the city? Did they not live in the city? So that was really interesting for us to find.
Yeah, there is some literature that says, neighborhoods can have a, kind of a buffering effect to some negative predictors or negative outcomes. And so to get into that a little bit further would be interesting. Sir, did anything surprise you in terms of the results?
Not really, because I feel like it's very, it makes sense that if students have higher GPA, the mother will support them. And if because of economic pressure, they will be less likely to go to college or do things that they want to. Yeah.
The last question, and you all probably touched on it briefly in your presentation, but if we're going to leave everybody with, what's your take-home message? What is, what are you done? No, we're still going. Yeah. What's your take-home message to the audience, and what is kind of your broad implication for all the hard work that you've done? I don't care. So what, if you're in an elevator with somebody and then someone said, what was the summary of your research? What do you think is the one thing that you'd want to leave that person with in terms of your findings?
I would probably say that just like a lot of things that affect you as a child, you don't realize could affect you into adulthood. So with this study, it was economic pressure that the parents were feeling when their child was at a young age. And then that stress and hair cortisol followed them into adulthood. And so it's just like you don't realize how much things affect you when you're younger and then when you get into adulthood. And I also thought it was interesting, like there was sort of a correlation, so not in our pilot sample, but the full sample, the economic pressure felt by G1 was correlated to the economic pressure felt by G2. And I wonder if that has to deal with like maybe the children saying like, I don't want to have that pressure when I grow up. And so then they work to not have that pressure. And that's what I've kind of speculated is why there wasn't a correlation in our smaller pilot sample, but it still was correlated in our full sample.
So chronic stress is something, it's an important thing to be aware of, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Good.
I'm not very sure one person, so this is a really difficult question.
And I'm asking you to narrow it down, right?
Yeah, I would say something that Jill and I both talked about when we really considered why this research was important or maybe, innovative, was that because of COVID, older adults have gotten so much more attention and people are, paying attention to what older adults need and all these things, when in reality, those problems existed before this all happened, but older adults are kind of sparsely studied. So just as someone who's really interested in housing older adults is really important, and they are growing. The current system we have now will likely not be able to support them as they grow. So I would just say it's really important to find solutions that can keep older adults comfortable or safe. Or my research didn't cover this, but what they should do if they can't stay where they are. So for example, home modifications can be really crucial in keeping an older adult safe in their home. And two, like just paying attention to those disparities that are present, because those are things that kind of like you pointed out, it was probably that in early life, a minority ended in a home that was older or had problems. And then you stay there. So those problems just compound. So the earlier you address those housing problems, the better you're putting everyone in the future.
Yeah, very good, very good. Sir?
I think I want people to take away from this research is that not everyone has the same experience. Some people may go through economic pressure, their parents, they may not have a job, they had, hard time finding a job, and some people will have a good life. They don't have to worry about, where their next food will come from, if even they have close to where they have a place to live. It's just that, some people have different experience, and even though they want to go to college because of their family situation, they don't have that opportunity to do it. So just think about how this economic pressure affect families, not only, for, how to pay for house or clothing, but for, your future education or your future life.
Mm-hmm. So not only are economics important, but so, your GPA and the support that you get from your family are also really important in determining how far you think you'll go, right? And so, to keep that in mind as you're working with potential college students, right? All right. Well, thanks guys very much. Y'all did a really great job.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Yes, of course, absolutely. You guys did great. And thanks to everybody for listening.
How many people are?
I don't know.
I think they have fluctuated a little bit.
You want me to just stop it?
Go ahead and end it. Yeah.